Good afternoon on this lovely sunny afternoon. I'll just leave it a couple of minutes to allow anybody who wants to listen in live to join us. I think that's about 3 o'clock, so I said I'd start now. Today is St Mark's Day, and I've been meaning to write some notes about reading Mark for ages, and so I took today as a deadline. I made it this afternoon, so I had this morning to work on it, and inevitably, yes, I was still going a few minutes ago. These are largely in preparation for next year, because starting in Advent we have the year of Mark. Each year the church's lectionary focuses on one of the different Gospels. This year it's Matthew, next year it will be Mark. And as I was looking through it, I got really frustrated because I don't think they treat Mark particularly well. But perhaps that's inevitable when you're trying to put a lectionary together. But what's the point? It seems to me that most of us know the gospel story very well. We know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, was baptized by John in the River Jordan, started his ministry in Galilee, and eventually was crucified in Jerusalem to be raised again 3 days later. Okay, we know that. And I'll bet if I told you any of the stories from the Bible, from the gospel stories, you'd know them. You'd know how they started, how they finished. But there are 4 gospels. And God seems to have inspired 4 different stories, approaching the whole story of Jesus from different perspectives for different people. And with different emphases. So how do we disentangle that? It's almost as though we took our most prized meal. Think of your favourite recipe, that if it was tonight, your mouth would right now be watering. Yes, right. But then somebody comes along and says, oh, that's fantastic. I tell you what, we'll pop it in a food processor, whiz it all up, and then give it you in a bowl as a bowl of mush. My guess is most of us would be desperately disappointed. But that's what we do with the Gospels. The most wonderful story told from nuanced different perspectives, and we blend them together. Great for children in nativity plays, blended fools, perfect for a baby. But actually, as we grow up, we need more meat and veg, and to deal with it in a more focused way. Most people say that you can read Mark through in an hour and a half without much difficulty. I tend to allow 2 hours. I've probably first started doing this in about 2009. That's how far back my notes go. I did it again yesterday and had a page full of notes. It always rewards rereading, retelling, re-listening to Mark. So what is it about Mark? What questions can help us read Mark? And that's what I want to focus on now. I don't want to tell you what Mark's all about. I want to give you questions that might help you discover for yourself. And I'll explain more of why later. First of all, thing to say is that Mark seems to be a single narrative, a single story. That's really quite distinctive from the other Gospels. Matthew famously has the Sermon on the Mount. You know exactly when it starts and exactly when it finishes. But in Mark, it's not quite like that. Take chapter 1, verse 14. Jesus has been baptized by John. We've had John introduced. And he starts his ministry. But Mark doesn't allow us to draw a nice little line. Verse 14 says something like, when John was put in prison, Jesus began his ministry. So which section would verse 14 come into? It bridges them. And Mark keeps you going. He wants to hold on to you through the whole story. And that's vital. Second thing about Mark is it's a downhill story all the way. The biggest crowds are John the Baptist's. All of Jerusalem and Judea come out to him. As the story goes on, opposition to Jesus grows, crowds get smaller, the disciples fail. That's quite distinctive in Mark. There's arguments about the end of Mark. Does it finish at chapter 16, verse 8? The women had been told to go to the disciples and tell them that the risen Jesus would meet them in Galilee. But they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. But quite a few folk think that Mark missed out, that there is an ending that he meant to add, or he did add and was lost. I think the whole narrative moves to that point. And there are, in most Bibles, a couple of additional endings which people at different times have written. And indeed, Matthew and Luke, who use Mark, add resurrection appearances. But I don't think Mark intended that. There is that final devastating verse which kind of brings together Mark's narrative. Why? The clues are all in his narrative. It doesn't come as a surprise if you've really read Mark. The other thing about it being a single story is that there are interlacing themes. I mentioned that Mark starts with John the Baptist. But John the Baptist doesn't stay at the beginning of Mark. He keeps cropping up. So, a little while later, John the Baptist is executed. It's a bit of an inserted passage. Why on earth does Mark put it there? It's a flashback. But he wanted that. A little later on, Jesus asks that famous question, who do people say that I am? Some say John the Baptist. Jesus gets confused with John the Baptist. Indeed, he did by Herod in the story of of John the Baptist's execution. And perhaps most remarkably, when in the final days Jesus is challenged, by what authority do you do these things? His reply is, I tell you what, I'll ask you a question. By what authority did John do these things? We don't know, they thought. If we say it's from God, Jesus will say, why didn't you believe him? If they say, no, he was just a clever preacher, the crowds will riot. And when they can't give an answer, Jesus says, neither will I tell you by what authority I do it. He's identifying his authority with John's. Remarkable. Why? There's a rich thing to be explored there. But why don't you do it? There are other things as well. Bread. Mine's gone blank. Bread keeps coming up. Feeding the 5,000. Feeding the 4,000. The Syrophoenician woman cleverly saying, can't the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table? What connects all these things? They interweave to form a beautiful fabric narrative. There are storms, there's the sea. All these things keep cropping up at significant moments. What is Mark doing with them? These are questions to ask. Do you know, as I read this, I've read it before, but it's slightly different. What's going on? So, Mark's got this long single narrative that he expects to go on for a couple of hours, but he wants to draw our attention to particular points at particular times. How does he do it? Well, one of his ways is dramatic detail. Chapter 1, after we've had the disciples called up the fishermen by the lake, come follow me. Rat-tat-tat, different. Heals this person, restores that person, throws out a demon there. And then at the beginning of chapter 2, the pace changes, and we suddenly get a lot of detail. Jesus is in a crowded room of a house. People can't get in. It's so popular. But in the front row, there are his judges. There are the scribes and the Pharisees waiting for him to trip up. There's folk trying to get folk to Jesus to heal them. And he tells the story of people climbing up on the roof. Can you imagine being told that story in a room? Glancing up at the ceiling as it goes on. Almost hearing the footsteps across the roof. What? Then the hole in the roof starts to appear. Lumps of roof fall on you as the hole is dug. Mark is slowing you down, grabbing your attention. You might have been rattling through, but hang on, listen to this. Your sins are forgiven. And the question, who is this that forgives sins? Why does Mark particularly draw attention to that? Why does he want you to remember it as we go on? These are the questions that Mark is provoking you to ask as you read through his story. So that's dramatic detail. He also uses dramatic language from time to time. So he can talk about a blasphemy against the Holy Spirit and an unforgivable sin. The number of people who have got that phrase, unforgivable sin, in their mind in a troubling way. Why? Because it's so dramatic. It's actually stuck there, but out of context of the rest of Mark's Gospel, because we don't follow it through. That's why it causes trouble. So note the times when dramatically Mark grabs your attention. He can do it as well in a pretty weird way. Things that are out of time or place. And you think, why is he putting that there? I've already mentioned that the execution of John the Baptist is a flashback. But what about the Transfiguration? All of a sudden, Jesus is on a mountain with two Old Testament people who are way out of time. And he's glowing. In the other Gospels, you'd think it was a resurrection appearance. What's going on? Mark doesn't have resurrection appearances. What's this, if it isn't a resurrection appearance? Why here? Then, a more obviously out of place thing, there's a woman who at the beginning of chapter 14 anoints Jesus. And there's an argument about whether she should have done it because it was so extravagant. But Jesus says two things which are amazing. One is that she has anointed him in advance for his burial. And second, that what she has done will always be told in remembrance of her. But at the end of the gospel, the women don't get a chance to anoint Jesus. We all know that it was the women who went to the tomb first. What's going on? And whoever remembers this woman, who doesn't even have a name here, maybe she will later. Okay, so that there are things which are disjointed, which jar. Nice, smooth narrative. Except there are things that are out of place, and Mark is using that to grab your attention. It stops you in the just getting comfortable in the flow of the story. But then there's the repetitions, loads of them. There are two calling of fishermen. They happen right next to each other. What's the difference? And I wonder if Mark is actually saying in that early story, in chapter 1, verse 15 and following, whether he's saying, actually, look, watch out for this sort of thing because it's what I'm going to do a lot of. So there will be two storms that Jesus calms. Similar. Why does he repeat? Well, actually, what's the difference between the first and the second? Two feedings. What's the difference between the first and the second? Actually, a few verses later, Mark will tell you. He doesn't want you to miss the point. It's important. Then there's something that kind of goes along with the repetitions, and that's the sort of sandwiching. The technical term is intercalation. We intercalate one story into another. The most famous is Jairus' daughter. We get Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, who's worried about his daughter who's very ill. And Jesus starts to follow Jairus home. But a woman comes up and touches Jesus. She is absolutely embarrassed. Now, here we have Jairus, who embarrasses himself but is an honourable person. He's a ruler of the synagogue. Everybody takes their hat off to him. And this woman who is totally embarrassed because she's unclean, she's filthy. No matter how much she washes, no matter that she's a respectable person, lived a good life, she's considered dirty because of her illness. She creeps up to Jesus, hidden, touches the hem of his garment. Suddenly knows she's healed. What's more, so does Jesus. Turns around and says, "Who touched me?" Notice the dramatic detail, by the way. You can picture her standing up, knowing she's been called out, frightened of the crowd because they're all going to go, "Ugh!" What does Jesus do? He gets her to tell her story and then says, "It wasn't me, nothing to do with me. Your faith healed you." All of a sudden she's a hero. The story then resumes, and we go back into the story of Jairus' daughter. Don't bother the teacher who got tied up with this waste of space. Your daughter's dead. He missed his chance. Of course, we know how the story ended. We also get another point here. I talked about dramatic language. I should have said as well, sometimes Mark uses the Aramaic that Jesus would actually have spoken. Mark's Gospel is written in Greek, but Jesus would have spoken naturally Aramaic. And here, when Jesus goes into Jairus' daughter, He says Talitha cum. Goodness knows how you pronounce it. But he said that. The words that Jesus would have used in Aramaic that Mark then translates for us. Little girl, I say to you, get up. When Mark goes back to the Aramaic, it means a lot. He does it in the garden when Jesus is praying earnestly. Oh, if it's possible to get out of this mess, if it's possible not to be crucified, let me. And he uses the word for father, Abba, not Hopater, which would have been Greek, Abba, Aramaic. So how do we interpret, how do we get the meaning out of Mark? I think Mark's basic technique is called intertextuality. It's the way stories rub up against the other. That's what I've been talking about in the 20 minutes or so that I've been chatting so far. The way stories engage with one another so that, yes, you've got individual stories and individual parable, healing, but actually when you put them together, the sum is infinitely greater than the parts. The stories rub against each other. The clever thing about Mark is, without knowing a word of Old Testament, you can make sense of the story of Mark. But if you do know the Old Testament, you suddenly see that it relates to stories in the Old Testament. On the Mount of Transfiguration, you get Jesus with Moses and Elijah. Moses, the giver of the law. Jesus is the new law. Elijah, the famous prophet. Jesus is prophetic. They both speak of him. Jesus fulfills everything. So if you know the Old Testament, then you pick up the significance of Moses and Elijah. But if you don't, you've still got the sense that this is a huge event. There are loads of others allusions to the Old Testament. So another one, in the second story of the storm at the sea, Jesus is walking on the water and goes as if to walk past the boat. And the disciples are afraid. And Jesus says, don't fear, I am. Ego eimi, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, which is often translated Yahweh, but it's never actually spoken by an Orthodox Jew, because this is the very name of God. Don't worry, God's here. You're looking at him. It's a claim in Mark that Jesus is God. And why walking past? Because you can only see the back of God if you know your Old Testament. Moses was hidden in a cleft of rock so that as God walked past, Moses would see his back, but if he saw his face, he would die. This is God. This is a theophany, to use the technical term. So there's that sort of intercalation. When we go back to the story of the execution of John, that's actually an intercalated passage as well. And the outside story is that Jesus sends away the disciples to preach on their own, get a bit of experience, the way we do. You know, somebody says in church, oh, what about preaching? We need more preachers. And I say, hey, do you want to go? Get them going. That's what Jesus did. And at the end of the story, they come back and Jesus meets them. It's an intercalated passage. So what's going on? The disciples get to see that their ministry is dangerous, as John's was. This is written to Christians who are being persecuted. They know what it's like to have ridiculous trials, to be executed at a whim. just like John was. So the people who are reading have their own stories, which suddenly echo alongside the stories that Mark is telling. And I think this is at the heart of the way Mark works. So when you read Mark, what are the stories in your life that echo with his? What are the things where you feel you failed, as the disciples failed? Have you not stood up for Jesus when you could have done, as Peter did when he denied Jesus? The great hero of the church. But he denies Jesus. By the way, repetition, 3 times. It's not enough that he did it once. He did it 3 times. It's emphatic. It wasn't a slip-up. Do you ever feel like you're a failure? He was. What about even the hero women, who in all the other Gospels are the stars of the show at the end? They're the ones who stay at the cross. They're the ones who are first to the tomb. Even they fail in Mark. So do you feel that sometimes you've let God down? Maybe this is a gospel for you. How does your story echo with Mark's? Have you been healed? Are you like that woman who didn't dare to hope and yet did, touching the hem of Jesus' garments? Is that your story? Where do you see yourself in Mark? How do you then interpret the stories you're reading? And how do they interpret your story? So, on a practical level, what do we do? I said that it takes me a couple of hours to read Mark, but if I sat down and did it in a single chunk of 2 hours, by the time I'd finished, I'd be just blurry-eyed and just trying to get through it. So I usually divide it up into at least 2 hours, 2-hour slots. Everybody's different. Maybe yours will be shorter or longer. But I do try and read it all the way through. Second thing is keep a paper and pencil handy. You will, at some point, read something that makes you, oh wow, goodness, I've got to stop and take note of that. But if you get too involved in the detail at this stage, you're going to miss the flow. So have a paper and pencil and write notes. And then move on. But a word of caution, the temptation is just to write a verse or a very cryptic, quick note. If it's going to be a day or two before you read it, make sure that the note you've written you can understand. Maybe immediately you've finished writing, fill out the notes to reduce the interruption. So a pen and paper is essential. Be aware of the questions, and especially the things that Mark uses to grab your attention. They're not necessarily the techniques that a storyteller would use nowadays, but they are there, and Mark draws your attention to them. So listen to them. And I mentioned keeping notes. Even the best immediate notes will become cryptic after a year. But as I said, I've been doing this now for, 11 years at least. That's when my earliest notes go back to. And I'm still getting more. But I actually value being able to read up the notes that I've read in the past. They start to form a richer, fuller picture. So do go back and write up your notes, perhaps in a book or in some sort of blog on your computer. I use a program called Scrivener because I can organise all my thoughts on that. It's a very light word processor, but you get all your documents on screen that you can just move between them more easily than something like Word. Finally, enjoy it. This is a story. It's a cracking story told by a brilliant storyteller. And the important thing is to enjoy it. If you enjoy it, you will absorb it. And who knows, things might come to you in the middle of the night and disturb your sleep. Yeah, okay. So that's a warning. It does happen. Enjoy Mark. God bless. And on this St. Mark's Day, well, maybe it won't be today, But a job for today is to set aside time when you read through Mark. And I'll put notes. I've got them. They need a bit of revision. They will be on the website. I'll put this in a blog on the website hrr-churches.org.uk, so that you can, if you prefer to have a piece of paper, then you can do that. So thank you. God bless, and enjoy delving deeper into Mark's Gospel.